The massive doors of Nexus 7 Galactic Detention Center groaned open, revealing its newest inmate. Jake Miller walked forward with measured steps, his prison jumpsuit already soaked with sweat in the facility's artificial atmosphere. Two guards, their scaled skin reflecting the harsh overhead lights, prodded him along with electromagnetic batons. "Move faster, human," the taller guard growled, mandibles clicking in annoyance. "We don't have all cycle." Jake said nothing, maintaining his steady pace. His eyes, however, never stopped moving, taking in every detail of his new home. The prison's architecture was a mess of angular metal and force fields, designed to hold creatures from 1,000 different worlds. The air smelled of ozone and something else. Fear, perhaps. During processing, the prison AI scanned his biological data. Species, human. Planet of origin, Earth. Classification, Death World. The medical officer, a floating blob of translucent tissue, rippled in surprise at the readings. Unusual bone density, it noted, multiple eyes blinking in sequence, high muscle mass for species average, elevated neural activity. Marking for further observation. Jake stood perfectly still, his face betraying nothing. 6 months ago, he'd been commanding a security detail on a colony ship. Now he was here, charged with excessive force and disrupting galactic peace after defending his ship from pirates. The fact that those pirates had connections to the Galactic Council wasn't supposed to matter. The guards led him into the general population area. The massive chamber rose hundreds of meters, crisscrossed with walkways and filled with cells. Alien inmates of all shapes and sizes stopped their activities to stare at the newcomer. Some pointed, others laughed. "Look, another soft skin." A voice boomed from above. Jake looked up to see a massive creature leaning over a railing. Its gray, armored hide and multiple arms marked it as a Krax, one of the galaxy's self-proclaimed warrior races. "How long you think this one will last?" Another inmate shouted. "These humans, they break so easily." Jake's cell was on the 3rd level. It was barely large enough for a bed and toilet, with a force field instead of bars. His cellmate was already there, a bulky, purple-skinned alien with ridges running down its back. "Great," the alien muttered. "They stuck me with a breather." The term was a common insult for oxygen-dependent species. "Name's Jake," he said simply, setting down his meager belongings. "Don't care," the alien replied. "Just stay on your side, and try not to die too quickly. The cleanup crews hate dealing with human remains." Jake sat on his bed, back against the wall, watching the activity outside. Groups were forming and dispersing in patterns. Power dynamics played out in subtle gestures and positioning. It wasn't so different from the military, really, just with more tentacles and mandibles. During the evening meal period, Jake carried his tray of nutrient paste to an empty table. He didn't make it halfway there before a massive Krax stepped into his path. This one was bigger than the others, with battle scars across its armored chest. "New meat sits where we say," the Krax rumbled. "And humans," it grinned, showing rows of metallic teeth. "Humans eat on the floor." The dining hall went quiet. Other inmates turned to watch, anticipating entertainment. The guards at the perimeter made no move to intervene. Jake looked at the floor, then back at the Krax. 6 months ago, he would have tried to de-escalate. But 6 months ago, he played by the rules and still ended up here. "The floor looks pretty dirty," Jake said calmly. "I think I'll pass." The Krax's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with rage. Around them, inmates began to whisper and point. The human was either very brave or very stupid. Most bet on stupid. They had no way of knowing that Jake Miller had spent 15 years in Earth's Special Forces before taking the colony security job. They didn't know that humans, evolving on a planet that tried to kill them daily, had turned survival into an art form. But they were about to find out. The Krax's first punch could have shattered concrete. It hit nothing but air as Jake stepped aside, letting the massive alien's momentum carry it forward. Inmates gasped. Nobody dodged the cracks. "Stand still, you little worm," the alien leader, who others called Grunt, roared in frustration. Its secondary arms stretched out, trying to grab Jake. Jake moved like water, flowing between the grasping limbs. Earth's higher gravity had given humans one key advantage. They were faster than most species in short bursts. The cracks' movements, while powerful, seemed almost slow to Jake's trained eyes. "Fight back," Grunt demanded, smashing a table with its tail. Food trays went flying. Other inmates scrambled to get clear, forming a circle around the two fighters. The guards watched with mild interest, placing bets among themselves. "If you insist," Jake replied quietly. He had wanted to avoid this, but sometimes violence was the only language others understood. He waited for the next wild swing, then moved. To the watching crowd, what happened next seemed impossible. The human slipped inside the cracks' reach, where its powerful arms couldn't generate full force. Jake's elbow struck a point just below Grunt's primary heart, one of the few spots where the natural armor was thinner. Grunt wheezed, momentarily stunned. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. A series of precise strikes targeted nerve clusters and joint connections. He used the cracks' own weight against it, letting physics do what raw strength couldn't. The massive alien staggered, trying to understand why its limbs weren't responding properly. It had never encountered human martial arts before, techniques developed over centuries specifically to defeat larger, stronger opponents. "What? What are you doing to me?" Grunt gasped, one knee hitting the floor. "Teaching," Jake answered, delivering a final strike to a pressure point at the base of the cracks' skull. Grunt collapsed, conscious but unable to move. The dining hall fell silent. Even the guards stopped their betting to stare. A human had just taken down the prison's strongest inmate without throwing a single punch that could be called a weapon. "Anyone else want a lesson?" Jake asked quietly. Looking around the circle of shocked faces, no one stepped forward. He picked up his fallen food tray, got a fresh serving of nutrient paste, and sat at an empty table. After a few minutes, a small insectoid alien nervously approached. "May I sit?" it asked, mandibles clicking anxiously. "I'm Tim." Jake raised an eyebrow at the very un-alien name. The insectoid noticed his surprise. "It's not my real name," Tim explained, settling onto the bench. "My actual name takes 6 minutes to pronounce correctly. Humans always called me Tim back when I was a merchant." And it stuck. More inmates were watching them now, but with curiosity rather than hostility. The human had changed the prison's power dynamics in less than 5 minutes. "They'll come after you again," Tim warned, eating with quick, precise movements. "Grunt has friends, powerful ones." "They usually do," Jake replied calmly. He glanced at the guards, who were helping the still wobbly cracks leader to the medical bay. Their earlier amusement had turned to calculation. "But you've also made an impression," Tim continued. "Many here are tired of the cracks throwing their weight around. They just needed to see it was possible to stand up to them." Jake finished. Tim's antennae twitched in agreement. "There are things happening in this prison, human. Bad things. The guards are corrupt. The warden is worse. And inmates disappear if they ask too many questions." Jake thought about his own questionable conviction, about the justice system that had failed him. "Tell me more," he said. As Tim began explaining in hushed tones, Jake noticed other inmates giving him subtle nods of respect. He had survived his first real test in Nexus 7, but instinct told him bigger challenges were coming. The prison guards had finally stopped underestimating him. That would make things more difficult and more interesting. Word spread quickly through Nexus 7's cell blocks. Within days, every inmate knew about the human who had defeated Grunt without throwing a single real punch. But Jake wasn't interested in his newfound fame. He was watching, learning, and putting together pieces of a much bigger puzzle. "The guards change shifts at odd times," he said to Tim during their daily exercise period. "They walk the yard's perimeter, staying away from the various alien groups exercising their multiple limbs and appendages. Tim's antennae twitched nervously. I told you there was something wrong here. Watch the North Tower. Jake casually glanced up. A guard was passing a small package to another through a maintenance hatch. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. Smuggling, Jake said quietly. But what are they bringing in? Everything. Tim clicked his mandibles in disgust. Drugs that work on specific species, weapons disguised as medical devices, information from the outside. The guards sell to the highest bidders, and the cracks control most of the trade. A shadow fell over them. 3 inmates, a cracks and 2 reptilians, blocked their path. Enjoying your walk, human? The cracks sneered. This one was smaller than Grunt, but moved with a fighter's grace. Name's Brick. Grunt sends his regards. Jake noticed the yard going quiet. Inmates stopped their exercises to watch. The guards in the towers suddenly seemed very interested in looking elsewhere. That's nice of him, Jake replied calmly. How's his headache? Brick's scales darkened with anger. You got lucky once, but luck runs out, especially when. A loud alarm cut through the air. All inmates were ordered to return to their cells immediately. Brick gave Jake a cold smile before turning away. This is new, Tim said as they walked back. Midday lockdowns don't happen unless. They saw the reason as they passed the medical wing. Through the transparent walls, they glimpsed several inmates being treated for severe injuries. Their skin was covered in strange geometric burns. Dampening field burns, Tim whispered. From trying to break through cell force fields. But why would anyone? Jake remembered the package exchange he'd seen. They're testing something. The guards bring in tech. The inmates try to use it to escape, and someone watches what happens. Back in their cells, Jake noticed more details. The injured inmates had all been from different cell blocks. The testing was systematic, and if he was right, someone was using Nexus 7 as a private laboratory. That evening, the warden made a rare appearance in the general population area. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to absorb light. His species was unknown to Jake. Ah, the famous human, the warden said, stopping at Jake's cell. His voice was surprisingly gentle. I hope you're finding our facility educational. Very, Jake replied, meeting the warden's solid black eyes. Good, good. I do enjoy having interesting specimens in my collection, especially ones that exceed expectations. The warden smiled, showing teeth that seemed to shift and change shape. Do keep entertaining us. After the warden left, Tim spoke through the ventilation system connecting their cells. He never shows himself unless something big is happening. You've got his attention. Jake lay on his bed, thinking. The warden's words, the smuggling, the injured inmates, it all pointed to something larger. The prison wasn't just corrupt. It was a cover for something else. In the distance, he heard Grunt's voice, now recovered, rallying his followers. The Cracks gang would come for revenge soon. The guards were watching his every move. And somewhere above, a warden with shifting teeth was treating them all like lab rats. Jake smiled in the darkness. He'd been in worse situations during his Special Forces days. All he needed was time, information, and someone underestimating him again. Tim, he whispered through the vent, tell me everything you know about the prison security systems. The game was changing. Soon, everyone would learn why humans had a reputation for turning bad situations to their advantage. The attack came during the afternoon exercise period, exactly when Jake expected it. Grunt and Brick had gathered their entire gang. 6 Cracks and 4 other aliens of different species. They spread out across the yard, cutting off escape routes. Tim, Jake said quietly to his insectoid friend, get to the far corner. Now. Tim skittered away just as the first Cracks charged. Jake had spent the last week studying their movements, learning their patterns. Now that knowledge would keep him alive. No tricks this time, human, Grunt growled, his injured pride evident in his voice. "We do this the hard way." Jake noticed the guards clearing the yard of other inmates, giving the gang plenty of space. In the warden's tower, a dark figure watched with interest. The first attack came from behind. Predictable. A reptilian with natural bone blades swung at Jake's head. Jake ducked, letting the blades pass harmlessly overhead. He grabbed the alien's arm and used its momentum to throw it into an approaching Krax. "Spread out," Brick ordered. "Don't let him use our size against us." But that was exactly what Jake wanted. As the attackers spread out, they created gaps in their formation. Humans hadn't survived on Earth by being the strongest. They had survived by being the most adaptable. Jake rolled under a Krax's sweeping tail, coming up with a handful of yard gravel. A quick throw sent the small stones into a reptilian's sensitive eyes, temporarily blinding it. "He's armed," someone shouted. "No," Jake replied calmly, sliding between two attackers. "I'm just good at using what's available." He demonstrated this by grabbing a loose piece of exercise equipment, a simple metal bar. In his hands, it became an extension of his body, deflecting blows and striking pressure points with surgical precision. 3 attackers were down now, but the others had learned. They coordinated better, trying to hem him in. Jake felt his back hit the yard wall. Grunt smiled, thinking he had won. "Any last words, human?" the Krax leader asked. Jake looked up at the wall behind him. "Just one thing. Humans are really good at climbing." Before they could process his words, Jake had pushed off the wall, using their own tight formation against them. He vaulted over their heads, landing behind the group. 2 quick strikes with the metal bar took down another attacker. "Stand and fight," Grunt roared in frustration. "I am fighting," Jake replied. "I'm just not fighting stupid." He demonstrated by using one Krax's sweeping arm as a pivot point, swinging around to kick another in the face. The yard had gone completely silent except for the sounds of combat. Even the guards had stopped pretending to look away. Brick tried a new tactic, pulling out something that looked like a shock prod, clearly smuggled in by the guards. But Jake had anticipated this too. He threw his metal bar, hitting Brick's hand and sending the weapon flying. The fight had been going for less than 5 minutes, but the yard was already littered with groaning attackers. Only Grunt and Brick remained standing, both looking considerably less confident. "This is what happens," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "when you think strength is everything. Humans don't survive by being the strongest. We survive by being the smartest fighters." He proved his point by finishing the fight with the same move he used on Grunt the first time. Precise strikes to nerve clusters that left both Krax unable to stand. In the sudden silence, Jake picked up the smuggled shock prod and walked to the nearest guard tower. He held it up for them to see. "I believe this is contraband," he said clearly. "You might want to explain to the Galactic Authority how it got in here." The guards shifted uncomfortably. In the warden's tower, the dark figure leaned forward with increased interest. Jake turned to the gathered crowd of inmates. "Next time," he announced, "bring more friends." As he walked away, Tim fell in beside him. "You realize you've just challenged the entire system, right?" Jake smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I wanted to do." The game was changing, and Jake Miller was ready to flip the whole board. Jake sat in the dim light of his cell, studying the small data chip Tim had smuggled to him. It contained proof of what they'd suspected. Nexus 7 wasn't just a prison. It was a testing ground. "The warden," Tim's voice whispered through the vent, "he's been selling access to the prison to weapons manufacturers. They use inmates to test new containment systems." "That explains the dampening field burns," Jake replied quietly. "But there's more to it, isn't there?" The sound of guard boots echoed down the corridor. Both inmates fell silent until the patrol passed. The night shift was when the real business of the prison happened. "Much more," Tim continued. "Some inmates don't just disappear. They get transferred to a secret section. the ones with unique biological features. Jake thought about the warden's words, interesting specimens in my collection. The implications made his jaw clench. A soft tone in the distance signaled a shift change. Jake had memorized the patterns. They had 3 minutes before the next patrol. "We've got allies," he said. "The fluid mines in Block C want to help. The Silicon Group from Block D too. Even some of Grunt's old gang reached out. They're afraid of the warden." Tim clicked nervously. "Everyone's seen too much. The guard who dropped that shock prod found him in his quarters this morning. They say it was an accident." Jake had spent the last week building a network of contacts throughout the prison. Humans were good at forming alliances. It was how they'd survived on Earth. Now those skills were proving useful again. The next patrol passed, right on schedule. "Tomorrow," Jake said during morning meal, "watch the kitchen staff." He convinced several inmates who worked in the kitchen to help. They would prove that the guards were smuggling more than just weapons. They were bringing in illegal biological samples. Morning came slowly. Jake watched through his cell's force field as inmates shuffled to breakfast. Everything looked normal, but tension filled the air. In the dining hall, Jake sat with his usual tray of nutrient paste. Tim sat across from him, antennae twitching with nervous energy. Around them, other inmates from different species tried to look casual. The first sign that their plan was working came when a guard rushed into the hall, face pale. He whispered something to the shift supervisor, who immediately activated his comm unit. "What did you do?" Tim asked quietly. "The kitchen staff accidentally left some storage units unlocked," Jake explained. "Units containing some very interesting samples the warden wouldn't want anyone to find." Alarms began blaring. Guards rushed to secure the kitchen area. But it was too late. Inmates had already seen what was hidden there: genetic samples, experimental drugs, and worse. The warden appeared at the dining hall entrance, his shifting teeth clenched in anger. His eyes found Jake immediately. "Lock down the facility," the warden ordered. "No one leaves their cells until further notice." As guards began herding inmates back to their blocks, Jake caught glimpses of his allies spreading the word. By lights out, every prisoner would know what had been discovered. "They'll come for you," Tim warned as they were marched back to their cells. "I'm counting on it," Jake replied. "But they'll have to be careful now. Too many inmates know the truth." Back in his cell, Jake lay on his bed, thinking. The warden would make his move soon. But Jake had already planted seeds of rebellion throughout the prison. Humans were dangerous not just because they could fight, but because they could plan, organize, and turn enemies into allies. The warden was about to learn this the hard way. "Tim," Jake whispered through the vent, "tell our friends to be ready. Tomorrow, we show them why you should never corner a human." In the darkness, Jake smiled. The prison was a powder keg, and he had just lit the fuse. The warden's order crackled through secure channels at midnight. "The human dies tonight. Make it look like a fight." Jake lay on his bed, eyes closed but fully alert. He'd known this was coming. The guards' boot steps were too quiet, too careful as they approached his cell. "Now," Jake whispered into a tiny communicator Tim had assembled from stolen parts. The prison's lights went dark. Emergency systems failed to activate. In the confusion, Jake moved. Years of special forces training had taught him to fight blind. The guards, dependent on their equipment, stumbled in darkness. 4 quick strikes, and 4 bodies hit the floor. "All blocks, execute," Jake commanded through the communicator. Across Nexus 7, carefully planned chaos erupted. In Block C, the fluid mines oozed through ventilation systems, disabling security cameras. Block D's Silicon Group overrode door controls, releasing selected inmates. "The humans loose," a guard shouted. "Lock down all sectors." But the lockdown commands didn't work. Tim, hidden in the prison's maintenance tunnels, had spent days rewiring critical systems. Nothing responded to guard controls anymore. Jake moved through the darkness like a ghost. Two more guards rounded a corner, weapons raised. He didn't fight them. He didn't have to. A Cracks inmate, one of Grunt's former gang members, emerged from shadows and handled them. "We're even now, human," the Cracks growled. "Watch the north corridor," Jake replied. "The warden will send reinforcements." The sound of alarms finally filled the air, but they weren't prison alarms. These were different. Distress signals broadcasting to Galactic Authority channels. Tim's final gift to the corrupt administration. "Stop those transmissions." The warden's voice boomed through working speakers. "Kill the human. Kill anyone helping him." Jake reached the central security hub. Bodies of knocked-out guards littered the path. His allies had done their work well. Inside, Tim was waiting with several other inmates. Transmission complete. Tim clicked excitedly. Every Galactic Authority within 3 sectors just received proof of the warden's experiments. "He'll try to purge the evidence," Jake said, taking position by the door. "Which means..." The wall exploded inward. The warden stepped through the debris, his form shifting and growing. Gone was the thin, pale figure. Something monstrous took its place. "You've ruined everything." The warden's voice distorted as his teeth multiplied. Years of research, millions in profits, all destroyed by one insignificant human. "That's your mistake," Jake replied calmly. "Thinking humans are insignificant." The warden lunged with impossible speed. But Jake had planned for this too. Hidden panels in the floor opened, and the fluid mines emerged, wrapping around the warden's limbs. The silicon group activated dampening fields, the same ones the warden had tested on inmates. "Impossible," the warden thrashed. "These systems are locked to my genetic code." They were, Tim agreed, until we rewrote them. The same way you rewrote so many inmates' genetics with your experiments. Through the broken wall, Jake saw Galactic Authority ships descending through the prison's atmospheric shields. Perfect timing. "You know what humans are really good at?" Jake asked the restrained warden. "Learning from others, building alliances, and making sure bullies face justice." The warden's roar of rage was cut short as the dampening fields knocked him unconscious. In the distance, Galactic Authority forces were already securing the prison. Jake looked at his gathered allies. Insects, minerals, fluids, and even former enemies, all united against a greater evil. "Anyone else think humans aren't worth respecting?" he asked with a slight smile. The answering silence spoke volumes. In Nexus 7, the legend of the human who brought down a corrupt empire would live forever. 3 months after the Nexus 7 uprising, Jake stood before the Galactic Council. The Great Chamber, with its towering crystalline walls and floating platforms, held representatives from 1,000 worlds. "The evidence is clear," the Chief Justice announced, her multiple eyes blinking in sequence. Former Warden Vex conducted illegal genetic experiments on inmates, sold restricted weapons technology, and violated 37 separate galactic laws. Jake watched as guards led the former warden away. The once mighty creature was contained in a special cell, his shifting powers permanently dampened. Some of his victims, former inmates who had survived his experiments, watched with satisfaction. As for the human, Jake Miller, the Chief Justice continued, all charges against him are dismissed. The attack on his colony ship was indeed orchestrated by criminal elements within the council. Tim, standing beside Jake in a formal merchant's robe, clicked his mandibles happily. The insectoid had been released weeks earlier and immediately testified about everything he had witnessed. Furthermore, the Justice raised her voice. "This council commends Jake Miller for exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of our justice system." The chamber erupted in discussion. Some representatives looked uncomfortable. Their own corrupt dealings had been exposed in the investigation that followed the Nexus 7 incident. After the hearing, Jake met with his former allies in a nearby station's gathering hall. Grunt was there, along with members of the Fluid Mines and Silicon Group. The experience had changed them all. "The new prison administration is much better," Grunt reported. His time would be reduced for helping expose the corruption. No more experiments. No more disappearances. The Galactic Authority asked me to help review security at other facilities. Jake told them. They want to prevent another Nexus 7 situation. They fear humans now, Tim observed. Not because you're strong, but because you showed them something worse. The power to unite others against them. A news hologram flickered in the corner, showing footage from the uprising. The story had spread across the galaxy. How one human had turned a prison's population against its corrupt leaders. How species that had been enemies worked together. How justice finally reached those who thought themselves above the law. We learned something too. A member of the Fluid Minds rippled thoughtfully. Humans are not what we thought. You are not simple warriors or weak, soft skins. You are catalysts. Jake understood. Humans had survived Earth by building communities, by turning rivals into allies, by outsmarting stronger predators. Those same skills had brought down a corrupt prison system. What will you do now? Tim asked. Jake pulled out a data pad showing his new assignment. The council wants me to train their security forces, not just in fighting, in thinking, adapting, building trust across species. The student becomes the teacher, Grunt rumbled approvingly. Perhaps some good came from our first fight after all. As his former inmates, now friends, shared stories and plans, Jake reflected on his journey. He had entered Nexus 7 as a prisoner and emerged as something more, a symbol of what humanity could offer to the galaxy. One more thing, Tim clicked excitedly. They're making changes to the Galactic Legal Code, adding new protections for prisoners, better oversight of facilities. They're calling it the Miller Protocols. Jake smiled. The biggest victory wasn't bringing down one corrupt warden, it was changing the system itself. A year ago, aliens had dismissed humans as weak creatures from a backwater world. Now they understood. Humanity's strength wasn't in their muscles or weapons, but in their ability to unite others, to fight smart instead of strong, to face impossible odds with cunning and determination. To new beginnings, Jake raised his drink. To humans, the others responded. The species that taught us all to think differently. In the depths of space, the legend of Nexus 7 spread. The story of a human who turned a prison into a revolution, who proved that true strength comes in many forms, and who showed the galaxy why you should never, ever underestimate humanity.